There are moments in life that don't announce themselves with noise. They don't arrive wrapped in certainty or marked by dramatic turning points. They appear quietly, almost invisibly, and by the time you recognize them, they've already changed the way you think. I've spent years believing that understanding was something you earned through time, that people slowly became familiar to each other through countless conversations, shared memories, disappointments, forgiveness, and the ordinary rhythm of existing side by side. I believed closeness was built like a house, one careful piece at a time. Now I'm not as certain, not because I've stopped believing in time, but because I've learned that sometimes a single presence can make you question everything you thought you understood about it. I don't mean attraction. I don't mean admiration. I don't even mean trust. Those are names people give to experiences after they've already happened. I'm talking about something quieter, something that doesn't ask to be named. It simply changes the way your own mind sounds when you're alone. For most of my life, I've relied on structure. Every thought had a place. Every emotion had a reason. Every reaction could be traced back to something I understood. If something felt unfamiliar, I analyzed it. If something threatened my balance, I stepped away from it. If someone became difficult to read, I accepted that not every mystery needed solving. It was a peaceful way to exist. Predictable, ordered save. People often mistake silence for emptiness. It isn't. Silence is where I organize myself. It's where unfinished thoughts become clear. It's where questions settle long enough to reveal whether they're worth asking. When I disappear into quiet, I'm not escaping the world. I'm rebuilding my own. That's why I've always been careful about who enters it, not because I fear people, because I value clarity. The louder someone insists on being understood, the harder it becomes to hear what they're actually saying. Most conversations never move beyond performance. People present polished versions of themselves. They predict reactions. They adjust their personalities. They unconsciously negotiate acceptance. There's nothing wrong with that. It's human. But it also means very few interactions ever reach the place where someone is simply present, without performance, without strategy, without trying to become memorable. I've met countless people, some fascinating, some kind, some unforgettable, for reasons I still can't explain, yet almost every interaction followed the same invisible pattern. Eventually, I understood where they were coming from. Eventually, they understood the version of me I allowed them to see. The distance remained comfortable, predictable. Neither side asked for more. I convinced myself that was enough. Maybe it was, or maybe I simply stopped expecting anything different. Expectations can quietly become limitations if you hold on to them long enough. You begin believing that because you've never experienced something, it probably doesn't exist. Then life introduces a single exception, not to prove you wrong, only to remind you that certainty has a smaller imagination than reality. That's what unsettled me. Not someone else's presence, my own response to it, because the change wasn't dramatic, there wasn't a defining conversation. No unforgettable confession. No moment that could be replayed like a scene from a film. If someone asked me when everything shifted, I honestly couldn't answer. It happened too gradually to notice, like daylight replacing darkness. You never see the exact second night disappears. You only realize it's morning after everything around you already looks different. That's how awareness changes. It doesn't arrive, it accumulates, one observation, one silence, one ordinary moment after another, until suddenly your perspective has become someone you no longer recognize. I noticed myself paying attention differently, not more. Differently, instead of focusing on what was being said, I started noticing what remained unsaid, the pauses, the moments where conversations ended naturally instead of being forced to continue. The comfort of not needing immediate explanations, it made me wonder how much of human connection actually exists beyond language. We're taught that communication depends on words. I'm beginning to think words are only translations. The experience itself happens somewhere much quieter. Some people speak endlessly because silence frightens them. Others stay silent because they fear being misunderstood. But every so often, silence becomes something else entirely, not absence, presence. A space where nothing needs defending, nothing needs decorating, nothing needs improving. I've always respected people who could sit comfortably inside that kind of stillness, not because they appeared mysterious, because they appeared honest. It takes remarkable confidence to stop performing, to let moments exist exactly as they are, without rushing to explain them, without demanding they become something larger. Most people believe certainty comes from answers. I'm starting to suspect it comes from observation. The longer I watched my own thoughts, the less interested I became in quick conclusions. Understanding isn't something you capture. It's something that slowly reveals itself after you've stopped trying to force it. That's uncomfortable. We live in a world that rewards immediate opinions, instant definitions, fast certainty, yet the most meaningful realizations I've ever experienced arrived slowly enough that I almost missed them. Perhaps that's why they lasted. Anything that enters your life quietly often stays longer than the things that arrive, demanding attention. Noise fades. Presence doesn't. I don't know exactly when I stopped measuring people by what they offered and started noticing how they affected the quality of my own thinking. It's an unusual question to ask yourself. Not, do I like this person? Not, do they understand me? But, who do I become in the presence of their existence? That's a more difficult question because it isn't really about them. It's about the version of yourself they accidentally reveal. Most people reflect our habits. Very few reflect our possibilities. There's an important difference. Habits keep us recognizable. Possibilities remind us we're unfinished. For years, I believed I knew myself completely. Every strength, every limitation, every hidden corner I preferred not to examine too closely. Self-knowledge became another form of certainty, comfortable, relayable, almost permanent. Then I began noticing tiny inconsistencies, not flaws, openings, places where certainty suddenly became curiosity, places where old conclusions no longer felt complete. At first, I resisted that feeling, not because change frightened me, because unnecessary change wastes energy. I've never admired transformation for its own sake. Growth without direction is just movement. I needed a reason before allowing anything to reshape the architecture of my inner world. What surprised me most was realizing that sometimes the reason isn't an event, sometimes it's simply becoming aware that you've outgrown an older way of seeing. And once that awareness appears, pretending not to see, it becomes far more exhausting than accepting it. That's where I find myself now, not standing at the edge of certainty, not rushing toward answers, simply recognizing that something inside me has begun asking different questions than it used to. Questions I can't ignore, questions that don't demand immediate responses. Only honesty. Perhaps that's where every meaningful change truly begins, not with a decision, not with an emotion, but with a quiet recognition that the person who asked yesterday's questions is no longer the same person listening for today's answers. The strange thing about real change is that it almost never announces itself while it's happening. You expect transformation to feel dramatic. You expect it to arrive with unmistakable signs, with moments so obvious that you can point to them years later and say, that was where everything became different. Life rarely works that way. Most of the shifts that redefine us happen quietly enough that we continue living as if nothing has changed at all. Only later do we notice that our thoughts no longer return to the places they once called home. I've been paying attention to that more than I used to. Not to the world, to myself. There was a time when I believed self-awareness meant having answers, knowing why I reacted the way I did, understanding every emotion before it became visible, predicting my own decisions long before I made them. It felt like control. Now I realize it was something else. It was familiarity. There's a difference. Control suggests mastery. Familiarity simply means you've lived with the same version of yourself for so long that nothing surprises you anymore. Maybe that's why genuine change feels so unsettling. It introduces you to parts of yourself that have always existed, but never had a reason to step forward. You don't become someone new. You discover someone who was waiting beneath everything you already knew. That realization has stayed with me. It lingers in ordinary moments, while walking through crowded streets, while staring out of a window without realizing how much time has passed, while listening to conversations that somehow feel louder than they need to be. The world hasn't become noisier. I've simply become more aware of what silence teaches. Silence isn't the absence of sound, it's the absence of distraction. And without distraction, you begin hearing thoughts that have been waiting patiently for your attention. Some of them are uncomfortable. Others are unexpectedly honest. I've learned not to interrupt them anymore. There was a period in my life when every uncertain feeling had to be solved immediately. Every unanswered question felt incomplete. Every loose thread demanded resolution. I mistook closure for peace. But peace doesn't always come from finishing a story. Sometimes it comes from allowing a story to unfold at its own pace. That's much harder than people admit. Patience sounds beautiful until you're the one expected to practice it, especially when your own mind keeps reaching for conclusions before reality has had the chance to reveal them. I've caught myself doing that more than once, trying to define experiences before they've had room to breathe, trying to explain feelings while they're still becoming themselves, as though language could somehow arrive before understanding. It can't. Words are slower than awareness. By the time we describe something honestly, we've usually been living it for much longer than we realize. Maybe that's why certain truths feel strangely familiar the first time we finally say them aloud. They aren't new. They've simply been waiting for our courage to catch up. Courage is often misunderstood. People imagine courage as loud decisions, bud declarations, fearless actions. I think courage is quieter than that. Sometimes courage is allowing yourself to remain uncertain without inventing false certainty, just to feel comfortable again. That kind of patience demands far more strength than immediate confidence ever could. I've begun respecting uncertainty, not because it's pleasant, because it's honest. It admits that reality is often larger than our first interpretation of it. And if reality is larger, then maybe we should become larger too. Not in importance, in perspective. Perspective changes everything. Two people can witness the same moment and carry completely different memories of it for the rest of their lives. Not because one of them is lying, because perception is never neutral. We don't merely see the world, we participate in creating the version of it we experience. That thought stayed with me longer than I expected. If perception shapes reality, then paying attention to how I perceive becomes one of the most important responsibilities I have. Not because I owe the world perfect understanding, because I owe myself honest observation. It's surprisingly difficult. The mind loves certainty. It fills empty spaces with assumptions. It completes unfinished stories. It predicts intentions before they're ever spoken. It would rather believe something inaccurate than admit it doesn't know enough yet. I've done that more times than I'd like to admit. Not intentionally, just humanly. But awareness changes your relationship with those habits. Instead of immediately believing every conclusion your mind offers, you begin asking quieter questions. Is this true? Or is it simply familiar? Am I seeing what's actually here? Or only repeating a pattern I've carried for years? Those questions have become constant companions. They slow me down. They interrupt old reflexes. They remind me that understanding requires humility before it ever becomes wisdom. Perhaps that's why I've become less interested in certainty and more interested in accuracy. Accuracy doesn't demand that life be simple. It only asks that we remain honest enough to see complexity when it exists. Most meaningful things are complex: identity, mirror, trust, hope. None of them fit neatly into explanations, yet we keep trying to reduce them until they feel manageable. Maybe that's where we lose something important. Not because simplicity is wrong, because reality often refuses to stay simple. I've started noticing another change too. I no longer measure the importance of a moment by how dramatic it appears. Some of the quietest experiences leave the deepest marks. A brief conversation remembered years later. An unexpected silence that somehow said everything words couldn't. A realization arriving while doing something completely ordinary. Life doesn't always whisper because it's small. Sometimes it whispers because only quiet attention can hear it. That thought has changed how I move through my days. I'm less interested in chasing extraordinary experiences, more interested in recognizing the extraordinary hidden inside ordinary ones. It's remarkable how much exists beneath the surface once you stop rushing past it. The world begins revealing details that were always there. Caprices people didn't realize they made. Changes in your own thinking that happen too gradually to notice. Questions you've been avoiding because answering them would require becoming someone slightly different. Those questions have a strange persistence. They don't disappear. They wait patiently until pretending not to hear them becomes impossible. I've reached that point. Not because life forced me there, because honesty eventually catches up with everyone willing to keep listening. I've spent enough time observing my own thoughts to recognize something undeniable. The person I was protecting so carefully no longer needs the same protection. Not because the world became safer, because I've become steadier. There's an important difference. Stability isn't created by avoiding change. It's created by trusting that change won't erase who you are. It will only reveal who you've been capable of becoming all along. That realization doesn't remove uncertainty. It transforms it. Instead of seeing uncertainty as an obstacle, I begin seeing it as evidence that I'm standing somewhere I've never stood before. And perhaps that's exactly where growth belongs. Not inside familiar territory, but at the quiet edge where familiar understanding ends and honest curiosity begins. I don't know exactly where that edge leads. Maybe no one ever does. But for the first time in a long while, I don't feel the need to rush beyond it. I'm content to remain here for a while, watching, listening, allowing each realization to arrive in its own time, because some truths aren't meant to be discovered through force. They're meant to be recognized the moment we're finally capable of carrying them. And I have a feeling I'm closer to that moment than I've ever been before. There's something unusual about the way the mind protects itself. It doesn't always build walls. Sometimes it builds routines, predictable ways of thinking, predictable ways of responding, the same interpretations repeated often enough that they begin to feel like reality itself. For a long time, I mistook consistency for truth. If I reacted the same way often enough, I assumed that was simply who I was. If the same conclusions kept appearing, I believed they had to be correct. I never questioned the framework itself, only the details inside it. Looking back now, I think that's how most of us live. We edit the story without ever questioning the narrator. We refine our explanations while leaving the lens untouched, and eventually we become so familiar with our own perspective that we forget it's only one way of seeing. That realization has been quietly reshaping me, not because it gave me answers, because it gave me permission to ask better questions, questions that don't rush towards certainty, questions that are willing to remain open long enough for something more honest to emerge. I've noticed how easily the mind creates permanence out of temporary experiences. One disappointment becomes a pattern, one betrayal becomes an expectation, one misunderstanding becomes proof that no one truly listens. It's understandable. The brain isn't trying to deceive us, it's trying to protect us. Parts make the world easier to navigate, but they can also become invisible prisons. You stop meeting reality as it is. You begin meeting your expectations instead, and expectations are remarkably persuasive. They convince you that you've already seen enough, that you've already learned the lesson, that nothing fundamentally new is waiting for you. I believed that for longer than I'd like to admit, not because I lacked hope, because certainty can become comfortable even when it quietly limits you. There's an odd safety in believing you've already figured life out. It removes the responsibility of remaining curious. Curiosity is demanding. It asks you to admit that you might be wrong. It asks you to revisit conclusions you once defended with complete confidence. It asks you to become a beginner again. That isn't easy, especially after you've spent years building an identity around being composed, observant, and deliberate. No one enjoys discovering that certainty sometimes disguises itself as wisdom. But I've started recognizing the difference. Wisdom leaves room. Certainty closes it. Wisdom listens longer than necessary. Certainty interrupts. Wisdom observes before speaking. Certainty prepares its answer before the question is finished. I wonder how many moments I've missed simply because I believed I already understood what I was looking at. Probably more than I'll ever know. There's humility in admitting that, not the kind that makes you think less of yourself, the kind that reminds you there's still more to discover. I've begun appreciating that feeling. Not knowing used to make me uncomfortable. Now it feels strangely alive, like standing before an ocean whose horizon refuses to reveal where it ends. You don't become frustrated that you can't see forever. You simply accept that some distances are larger than your current perspective. Perhaps understanding works the same way. It isn't something you conquer. It's something you slowly grow into, one honest observation at a time. The older I become, the less impressed I am by people who always seem certain, not because certainty is wrong, because life has taught me that the deepest minds rarely rush toward conclusions. They stay with complexity, they allow contradictions to exist long enough for a larger truth to emerge. That kind of patience is uncommon. Everything around us encourages immediacy, instant opinions, instant reactions, instant confidence. We've become uncomfortable with pauses, as though silence somehow weakens what we have to say. Yet, nearly every meaningful realization I've ever had arrived during moments when I wasn't trying to reach one. While washing dishes, walking without a destination, watching rain collect against a window, looking at nothing in particular, the mind has its own rhythm. It reveals things only after we've stopped chasing them. There's something beautiful about that. It reminds me that not every important discovery belongs to effort. Some belong to attention. Attention is different. Effort pushes. Attention receives. Effort insists. Attention notices. Effort wants results. Attention allows reality to introduce itself before deciding what it means. I've spent most of my life valuing effort, discipline, consistency, control. Those qualities still matter. But I've realized they become incomplete without attention. You can work tirelessly toward the wrong understanding if you never pause long enough to question your direction. That's a difficult lesson. Not because it's complicated, because it asks us to loosen our grip on the identities we've worked so hard to build. Identity can quietly become another habit. You repeat a story about yourself long enough that you stop noticing you're the one continuing to tell it. I've always been like this. I don't change. This is just who I am. Those sentences sound stable. Sometimes they're only familiar. I've stopped trusting familiarity quite as much. Not because familiarity lacks value, because growth often begins where familiarity ends. It's strange how subtle these shifts can be. No dramatic awakening, no life-changing speech. Just countless tiny moments where your relationship with yourself becomes slightly more honest than it was yesterday. One day, you will realize you no longer need to defend certain versions of yourself. Not because they were false, because they were incomplete. Completion isn't perfection, it's integration, allowing every part of yourself to exist without forcing them into constant agreement. Strength and tenderness, confidence and uncertainty, Lotseki and intuition, stillness and movement. Perhaps maturity isn't choosing one over the other. Perhaps it's learning when each belongs. That thought has stayed with me lately. I don't feel divided anymore. I feel unfinished. Oddly enough, that's a comforting realization. Being unfinished means possibility still exists. It means tomorrow isn't required to resemble yesterday. It means there's room for perspectives I haven't encountered yet. Room for conversations that challenge me, for silence that teaches me, for experiences that reveal dimensions of myself I've never had reason to explore. I used to think becoming yourself meant narrowing your identity until everything fit neatly together. Now, I think it's almost the opposite. Perhaps becoming yourself means becoming spacious enough to hold complexity without needing to eliminate it. That takes time. More importantly, it takes honesty. Honesty isn't simply telling the truth to other people. It's refusing to hide from the truth that's quietly forming inside you. Even when it asks you to release ideas you've carried for years. Even when it gently dismantles conclusions that once felt permanent, that kind of honesty doesn't arrive all at once. It unfolds, slowly, patently, like morning light, finding every corner of a room without ever forcing the darkness to leave. And maybe that's what real understanding has always been. Not a sudden revelation, not a perfect answer. Just enough light to see one step more clearly than you could yesterday. For now, that's enough. Because every genuine step changes the landscape that follows. And somewhere beyond the edge of what I already know, maybe have the quiet feeling that another truth is already waiting. Not demanding to be found, simply waiting until I'm ready to recognize it. Maybe this was never about finding certainty. Maybe that was the illusion I carried from the beginning. The belief that if I observed carefully enough, thought deeply enough, remained patient long enough, every question would eventually become an answer. But life doesn't owe us complete explanations. Sometimes it offers something quieter, a direction, a truth that doesn't remove every doubt, but gives you enough clarity to keep moving honestly. I've stopped expecting every meaningful experience to fit neatly into language. Some things are simply larger than the words we have available. The moment we try to reduce them into definitions, we lose the very depth that made them meaningful in the first place. So perhaps not everything needs a name. Perhaps some experiences are meant to remain open, continuing to shape us long after they first arrive. I've spent so much of my life believing that understanding meant reaching an ending. Now I wonder if understanding is simply learning how to stay present while the story continues unfolding. Because nothing truly alive remains still. Not people, not perspectives, not the quiet places inside us where change begins before we recognize it. Everything continues becoming, and maybe I do too. I've stopped measuring my life by certainty. I measure it by honesty now. Am I paying attention? Am I willing to let reality be more complex than my assumptions? Am I listening carefully enough to notice when an old version of myself is asking to be released? Those questions matter more than certainty ever did. They keep me awake to my own life. They remind me that awareness is not a destination you finally arrive at. It's a practice, a choice repeated in ordinary moments, a willingness to look again, even at things you believe you've already understood, especially then, because familiarity is where attention quietly falls asleep, and attention is too valuable to lose. Looking back, I can see how much energy I spent protecting parts of myself that no longer needed protection. Not because they were weak, because they had already grown stronger while I wasn't looking. Sometimes we keep guarding old wounds long after they've become scars. We continue defending ourselves against battles that ended years ago. Healing isn't forgetting what happened. It's realizing that your life no longer has to revolve around it. There's freedom in that realization, not dramatic freedom, not the kind that transforms everything overnight. The quieter kind, the kind that changes how you breathe, how you walk, how you respond when life refuses to follow your carefully prepared plans. You become less interested in controlling every outcome, more interested in meeting each moment honestly. That isn't surrender, it's trust. Not trust that everything will go your way. Trust that whatever comes, you'll meet it as the person you've become, not the person you used to be. I think that's one of the most overlooked forms of confidence. Not believing the future will always be kind. Believing you'll remain capable of facing it with integrity. Integrity has become more important to me than certainty. Because certainty changes, integrity stays. It reminds you to remain truthful when convenient answers become tempting. It reminds you to remain compassionate when judgment feels easier. It reminds you that your character is revealed far more by how you respond than by what happens to you. Perhaps that's what this entire journey has quietly been teaching me. Not how to understand life perfectly, but how to participate in it more honestly, to stop treating every unknown as a threat, to stop demanding immediate clarity from experiences still unfolding, to stop believing that uncertainty is the opposite of wisdom. Maybe uncertainty is where wisdom begins. I've realized something else too. The person I kept searching for wasn't somewhere outside me. It was the version of myself capable of seeing the world without the filters I'd spent years constructing, the version willing to admit that growth isn't becoming someone else. It's remembering the parts of yourself that certainty slowly taught you to ignore. Those parts never disappeared. They waited potently, quietly, trusting that one day you'd become still enough to hear them again. I think I've reached that stillness, not perfectly, not permanently, but enough to recognize its voice when it returns. And that's enough for now. Life doesn't ask us to know everything. It asks us to remain awake, to remain curious, to remain humble enough to let each experience reveal what it came to teach, instead of forcing it into lessons we already expected. There will always be more to understand, more to question, more to outgrow, that no longer feels overwhelming. It feels hopeful, because as long as there is more to discover, there is more life left to live with open eyes. So I won't rush toward conclusions anymore. I won't mistake speed for wisdom or certainty for truth. I'll continue paying attention. I'll continue listening beneath the noise. I'll continue allowing reality to surprise me, even when I think I've already understood it. Because every time I believed I had reached the end of my understanding, life quietly revealed another beginning. And maybe that's the real gift, not arriving, but remaining someone who is still willing to become. If there's one truth I want to carry forward, it's this. The deepest transformations rarely happen in the moments everyone else can see. They happen silently, one thought becoming slightly more honest than the one before it, one fear losing a little of its authority, one quiet realization replacing an old certainty, until one day you look back, not with regret, not with pride, but with gratitude. Gratitude for every question that refused to leave, for every uncertainty that kept your heart open, for every season that taught you to release who you thought you had to be. Because in the end, the greatest discovery isn't that the world changed. It's that you finally learned how to meet it without hiding from yourself. And perhaps that's what every journey has been leading toward all along, not perfection, not certainty, just the quiet courage to live truthfully. One honest moment, one clear breath, and one awakened step at a time.